It started as all great ideas do. Two mates in a bar with a couple of drinks, just sharing ideas. We decided to start a podcast. How original. We wanted to talk about fantasy books. We did that for a solid 6 episodes until he got busy, but I kept making videos, I kept reading books, and here we are a year later, 4,000 of you guys tuning and watching my videos. And in that time, I've discovered some incredible series. Today, I wanted to go over my top 10 favorite fantasy and sci-fi series that I've discovered in my first year on BookTube. Thank you so much for tuning in. While you're here, like the video, comment down below what the best book you've read in the last year is. And while you're there, subscribe as well. We have a great time here. We talk fantasy books. And with that, let's dive into my top 10 fantasy and sci-fi series of the last year. We'll go 10 through 1, and some of these series might seem unfairly ranked, and they might be lower than what they are perceived to be because I haven't read all the books in these series. So coming at number 10, we have The Wars of Light and Shadow by Janny Wurts. And this feels criminal to put at number 10, but I've only read one book, The Curse of the Mistwraith, so I can't put it any higher. Now, my sales pitch for The Wars of Light and Shadow is this is Malazan writing with the massive scope and classic fantasy storytelling of the Wheel of Time. So for me, this is Malazan meets Wheel of Time. And I think you're going to have to be a fan of both of those series to really get on well with this. But if you are a fan of both, you're going to love The Wars of Light and Shadow. Janny Wurts' writing style is very similar to Steven Erikson's, and the way she structures her stories is so compelling. She does very big, long chapters where you get a massive chunk of story with just one or two characters followed deeply with a third-person omniscient perspective. So like with June, you're jumping from characters head to head, so you really get to dive deep into all the characters. Then at the end of each chapter, she does like a one-page story from someone else in the world, and we get to catch up on what they've been doing. We might not have seen them for a few chapters, so we get to see what they're up to whilst we've just spent a big chunk of time with one group of characters. Then after that, she does 3 sentences, each just tiny little inklings of story from other places in her world. So we get lots going down at once. We get in-depth story for some people, and we just get little hints at other things going on around the world. And this just keeps her story so alive. So if you are looking for big classic fantasy, you have to check out this series. If you're looking for incredible writing, I think Janny is one of the best in this genre. You just have to check this series out. I can't say enough good things about it, and I cannot wait to dive further into this series. Then coming in at number 9, we also have just another incredible series, The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. So far, I've only read Assassin's Apprentice. I read it 2 weeks ago, and I had an absolute blast. And I may actually like The Wars of Light and Shadow more. I don't know why I put it at 9 and 10, but again, they're both incredible. Assassin's Apprentice kind of reminded me of Ranger's Apprentice, which is the series that got me reading when I was a kid, and it just felt like coming home. It was just that lovely classic fantasy, the young male POV, a coming-of-age story. We get really intriguing politics, and the writing style is just so easy to read and just consume. And as you would have heard with Realm of the Elderlings, the character work is just phenomenal. And because the character work is so phenomenal, you don't mind that the story's a little slower, and you just get to spend time in the world and spend time with the characters on their day-to-day. Then coming at number 8, we have a story that's coming a bit out of left field, and you probably don't see this, and you probably don't expect me to say this, but it was The Hunger Games. I had zero intention of ever watching or reading The Hunger Games, ever. But I had a few friends tell me at the start of the year, or at the end of last year, that I'm really missing out by not reading this story, and it's actually incredible. And they were completely right. I put on the Hunger Games audiobook when I had a 6-hour drive around the holidays. I listened to that book in that drive. I literally listened to book 1 in one sitting, and in the next week, finished off the other 2 books. This series was not what I was expecting. When I thought of the Hunger Games, I thought just Katniss Everdeen was just going to be an absolute just savage and just dominate everyone that she came across. But no, Katniss has such an incredible journey in the Hunger Games. She has her own skills and abilities, and she's incredibly determined, and everything you want in a main character and everything you want in a person. But she is still a teenager, and she goes through the Hunger Games and she survives, but she doesn't just lead a rebellion. She gets pushed around by the rebellion. They're trying to use her as a figure piece, and she's just trying to figure out how to survive and look after her family, and then realizing that she has potential to really help this rebellion, but they're just trying to use her. And the whole story just isn't about her just overcoming all the odds by herself. There's plenty of great side characters that also play big roles, and the whole just dynamics of the politics was super interesting. I love that it just wasn't a Mary Sue just taking over the universe. She's someone that, was getting pushed around and used, and she was just trying to make the best of the situation. And I found this story so compelling, and I just did not expect to like The Hunger Games, but I really liked it. And if you're looking for like a quick read to like break a slump, I definitely recommend it for that. So then at number 7, coming back to another big, massive series that I haven't finished reading yet, is Malazan, Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. So far, I've just read the first 2 books of this series. Now, I can't say much about Malazan that hasn't been said already, but the writing style of Steven Erikson is fantastic. It's very descriptive, and he writes a very dark fantasy story, but he also writes things on just a massive scope. So there's always a lot of characters you've got to follow. So sometimes I've found in the first 2 books that there's some characters that I find really compelling and I want to spend the whole story with, but there's also some characters that I would rather just not have their story at all, and I just don't like it very much. So in Guardians of the Wind, I had a really good time because most of the characters are good or great. So it was a really fun read. It was a really good read. And then with Deadhouse Gates, some of the characters were phenomenal, but others I didn't enjoy so much. So I have a more positive opinion of Deadhouse Gates, but also a more negative opinion of Deadhouse Gates because the characters I wanted to spend time with, 5 out of 5, 6 out of 5 chapters. The characters I didn't want to spend time with, I just didn't want to be reading those chapters. So I'm curious to see how I go with this series, if I find myself more and more interested in all the characters and the storylines that he has going on, or if I'm only going to be interested in part of the storylines he has going on. So I'm very interested to see how this goes because it's such a massive, sprawling story. So let's dial things back in. And number 6, let's go for a more contained story, something just set in one city, something still dark, very grim dark, but with heist themes. And that story is the Queen of Thieves Trilogy by Andy Peloquin. I've read about 10 of Andy's books this year and not a single one has missed. They've all been fantastic, but I think the Queen of Thieves Trilogy is my favorite. Andy specializes in just writing dark fantasy that's really easy to read. So it's got like that John Gwynne, Brandon Sanderson sort of writing style that's just super easy to digest, so you can fly through his books very quickly. And a lot of his stories center around assassins and thieves. He's got a few others around warbands and stuff that I haven't read yet, but I'm super excited to get into the Silent Champions. The books of his that I've read so far being Queen of Thieves, Dark Blade, Dragon Blood Assassin, are all assassin or thief centered. This story centers around the Night Guild, which is like a thieving guild, and we're following a girl as she is sold into it to pay off her father's debts to the guild, and she is trained up to become a thief. So we get to see her training in the book 1, plus a big heist at the end. And then in book 2, we see a massive heist. And then book 3, we basically see her leading the guild to save the city. It's just super compelling stuff. It's super short and easy to read. And it's just fast-paced, grimdark fantasy. So it definitely has vibes of Mistborn and Nevernight in it. And I just loved it. Now, after all those dark series, we need to talk about something light. So at number 5, we have Discworld by Sir Terry Pratchett. And if you've heard anything about Terry, you know he's witty, you know he's got tons of social commentary in his books, and they're just super sarcastic and comedic. The humour's that dry British humour, and it's all in a really absurd world where you have humans and dwarves and goblins and a bunch of different whimsical creatures, but somehow Terry is able to do all this humour, all this absurd stuff, but with really compelling stories that have some sort of message behind them. It's just such a fantastic blend. Terry is one of the best writers in fantasy or in the world, and it's a blessing that he chose to use fantasy as his medium for getting across words because he was a master at it, and these books are just the best blend of fun and compelling stories and just interesting information getting across in such an absurd way. Discworld's fantastic, and Going Postal was my favorite book of the series so far. So then, coming in at number 4, we have Red Rising by Pierce Brown. And this includes both series, books 1 to 3 and 4 to 6. This is just grim, dark fantasy in a sci-fi story. I think Pierce calls it sci-fantasy. It's pretty sci-fi, but it feels very fantasy. And I don't even know what to say about Red Rising. Like, it is massively popular for a reason. It's a compelling story. It's Hunger Games in space. It's what Star Wars should have been. The original trilogy is the rebels infiltrating the golds, the high class of society, and bringing them down from within. Sorry, I should have made that clear. Red Rising is one series, but when the author first released it, he kind of broke it up into a trilogy and then 4 books afterwards. I use trilogy here for both, mistakenly. And then the sequel trilogy is 10 years after, where the rebellion is trying to build up a new government system, but also deal with the rest of the empire that was still set up with the Golds in charge. Just like in Star Wars, the original trilogy ends with the Death Star blowing up. Yes, you get with the head leadership, but there's still a bunch of the empire that's still controlled by the rest. So what Star Wars should have done with the sequels is show Luke and Leia dealing with the rest of the empire whilst trying to build up their own new government system. That's exactly what Red Rising does in the sequels, and that's one of the reasons why I love it so much, because I used to love Star Wars, but it was ruined for me. And this took all my favourite elements of Star Wars and did what I wanted Star Wars to do. So then, coming in at number 3, we have First Law by Joe Abercrombie. So far, I've only read the first trilogy, and the way I describe this is just fun fantasy. I just did a full video on this last week. This is fun, compelling fantasy. You get really intriguing characters that you don't often get in other fantasy stories. Our young male POV isn't a good dude. He is a coward, but he kind of wants to do the best, but he's also just a lordling ass. And getting him as our young male POV, it's just so interesting because it's not what you'd normally get. And then we also get the POV of our slimy torturer. And he is so compelling because he was someone who was tortured himself for years before he just became twisted and became a torturer himself. And these are people that are messed up, but they're still trying to do good, and getting different characters doing the roles that we'd normally get in a classic fantasy story was just so interesting, so refreshing, and the way Joe Abercrombie writes is just so fun. I highly recommend this series for anyone getting into any sort of fantasy. So then there were 2, and putting one before the other was very tough for me. So we're not putting anyone at number 2, so we're just going to go 1A, 1B. So 1B, we'll go with Sun Eater by Christopher Ruocchio, but depending on the day, it would be 1A. This is called Dune Meets Name of the Wind. Sun Eater uses the storytelling element where our main character is writing these books for us. So our main character is Hadrian Marlowe. He's known as the Sun Eater, and on page 1 of book 1, he tells us he blew up a sun to destroy the alien Seosan race and also killed his emperor. And the Chronicles of the Sun Eater are his books that he's writing down to us, the reader. And if you haven't realized yet, by this being my number 1 and Farseer being on the list, I love that trope where we're getting our story told to us from the main character as they're telling it like what happened in their past. It's just something I love about books. I don't know why. Christopher is one of the best writers I've come across. And in book 1, he shows off his writing skill, but he doesn't really give us much plot. It's just all set up, getting us to know the characters so then we can get invested in them in the rest of the series. In book 2, it's slow again. It's a lot of build up, but the last 10 to 15% just goes off. And if you pay attention in Howling Dark, you can predict a lot of books 6 and 7, which is really fun to be able to just tease out what the author's giving to us and guess what's to come. But the story really gets going in Demon and White, Kingdoms of Death, and Ashes of Man. 3 of the best books I've ever read. The action is superb. This just reads like Star Wars when it comes to the action side of things. But the characters are super compelling. The growth and development of Hadrian and his friends across the series is impeccable. And this is a series that will have you excited, have you sad, have you angry, have you mad. You'll just feel everything reading these books, and it's such a great time. But there can only be one number 1. Well, technically 2 if you do what I do and go 1A, 1B. But the 1A for today is Empire of the Vampire by J. Kristoff. In the last year, I've already read this book twice, once December last year and once March this year to get ready for the second book that was Empire of the Damned, which I loved as well, though I would call this one my favourite. And J. Kristoff's writing style is my favourite in fantasy. closely followed by Christopher Ruocchio and Brian Lee Durfee. They've all got a very similar vibe about them, but Christopher's language just sticks with me most. It might be that we're both Australian, I don't know, but his language is so descriptive. His prose is the richest prose I've come across. He does dial his prose back a little bit here, whereas in his Nevernight Chronicles trilogy, it is very purple, which I love. It turns off a lot of people, but all of J. Kristoff's works that I've read, I absolutely love so deeply. And would you believe this is the cheapest book out of all of these? I got this for $10 from Big W. Like, what a steal. Look at that gold cover, absolutely stunning. You get artwork all through this. Like, come on, look at these absolute stunning drawings. I don't know why anyone wouldn't like this. Well, I do, but you're silly for not liking it. Look at that, absolutely beautiful. This is an epic fantasy story centered around vampires. How rare is that? This is a story of epic proportions. We're in a world where the sun has gone away. Something is blocking the sun, so vampires are able to be out 24/7. So what do? They start an empire. They take over the world. They started up here, but they've just been taken over everywhere. These vampires are different as well. Some of them have certain abilities that allow them to do one thing, some can do another. We've got other species in this world that are super interesting and compelling. The world building is phenomenal and it's tied into the plot because our main character's whole story is trying to find a way to get the sun back, to fight back against these vampires. And just like with Sun Eater, our main character is telling us his story. But instead of writing it down like Hadrian Marlowe, Gabriel de Leon is in a prison cell and he's sitting across from a vampire historian who's writing down his story. So every single sentence in this book pretty much is in quotation marks because this is all Gabriel talking to the historian. We're a fly on the wall in that prison cell. So the only time we don't get quotation marks on something that's happening is when it's Gabriel in the room with him and we jump back outside of the speech into his back and forth with the interviewer. And the back and forth between characters, the banter in this book, the dialogue is the highest point of this book. The dialogue and banter in this book is unrivaled with anything in the series. So it's elite characters, elite world building, elite plot, elite writing. It's super dark, it's super descriptive, it's so compelling. That is why this is my 1A. That's why this is the best series I've discovered in the last year and why it's a top 3 series all time for me. And coming back to what the plot is about, so I've got Gabriel de Leon telling his story about how he's been trying to stop the vampires in a cell to a vampire. Eventually his story is going to catch up to real time. We're going to find out what's been going on. Gabriel de Leon himself, I should have said this way earlier, is a Silver Saint. He is someone from a warrior sect of the church that has been fighting back against vampires his entire life. And he's the last one left. And I cannot wait for the last book to find out how he stops these vampires when we catch up to real time. I love this book. Now, if you're still here, thank you so much for tuning into my massive rant about Empire of the Vampire. Thank you so much for watching this whole video. It has been an absolute blast this last year, like talking to you guys and making content for you. I love talking about books. So please let me know down in the comments what are the best series you've discovered in the last year. And if you've read any of the ones I've mentioned today, let me know your thoughts on them. And if you want to read Kings of the Wild with me in August, jump down to the description and follow the link to my Fable book club. It's completely free. We're just going to be reading this one in August, telling each other our thoughts and seeing what we think about it. Thank you so much for watching and just have a great day.